Welcome to the brick capital of the world. For those of you that are not from London, in the past few days, in the build-up to the Olympics, I've had the privilege of being invited to a number of different events, and I think many people, I'm sure yourselves here in this building, deserve a lot of the credit for putting London at its shiniest best. And as I've walked from different formal discussion across different parts of London, it really has, in my opinion, felt something that's quite special and a truly global city. And it's something that I hope, I believe over the course of the next few days, people will appreciate more and more from events here. I also happen to have had the privilege of being at a number of the events in the short space since Friday night, including the opening ceremony, and I would say, I can't help referring to it because Lisa mentioned it in my CV, other than Barcelona in 1999 when Manchester United completed the treble, it was probably the best live event I've ever been at in my life. It was truly spectacular. Didn't quite compete with Barcelona, but... and I also happened to be at Wembley last night for Team GB, which put on a pretty special performance, which Ryan Giggs became the, I think, the oldest scorer of a goal in the history of the Olympics. So there you go. But it seems to me it is a wonderful opportunity for us in the great debate that quite a lot of serious analysis has been done in the past about the costs and benefits of hosting an Olympics for a city. As I've actually heard from some Chinese business people over the weekend, it seems to me in the simplistic, narrow analysis that can get far too simplistic, opening people's minds and eyes and ears to the way nations and cities can have a permanent interaction with other parts of the world is increasingly a key part of one of the motives of holding these events, and it seems to me you guys have certainly started off by pulling off the trick. In terms of what I want to show you with the slides and to really penetrate into your minds, we have started 12 years ago the century in which the Asian economies are going to take over. As you heard from Louisa, it's now actually right at the start of the century, 2001, when I had the good fortune of dreaming up the BRIC acronym. For those of you that don't know what it is, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And we argued in a number of papers, the most famous one being in 2003, that by 2035, those four countries' economies combined would become bigger than the GDP of the G7. And at the core of it, China, the big C in BRIC by 2025, or sorry, soon after 2027, will probably become as big as the United States. Soon after that, by 2004, I dreamt up a follow-up acronym called the Next 11, which is now rising in importance and usage. 6 of those 11 large populated countries also happen to be in Asia. Indonesia, Korea, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Vietnam. And together with the 4 BRIC countries and the other 5 in the Next 11, those 15 countries are 2/3 of the world's population. And as I'll show you with a couple of the pictures, most of what goes on in those countries are going to dominate the world economy increasingly as we go through the first half of this century. I've not yet developed the ambition to forecast anything beyond 2050. I'll be happy enough to find out whether I am still around at that time to see whether we said what could happen will, but it's a very exciting moment. And then for London, linking it to what I heard Kit saying, it seems to me the advantage of the time zone, the English language, the use of technology, Britain's history of being open to the world, and our flexibility of labour markets and our legal structure, all those 6 things together indeed do make London the natural BRIC capital of the world. And so long as we don't get too carried away with the emotions surrounding regulatory matters, which the Mayor is one of the rather pleasingly most powerful champions of making clear. It seems to me the natural progression is for London to become increasingly that key global city that it's already become. So I'm going to try and show you a few pictures. The 4 BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China, 2 of which are in Asia, and 4 of the so-called Next 11, Korea, Mexico, Turkey and Indonesia. And each of those will have a very significant influence on global GDP. What you probably should pay attention to, if you look at the very first bar, the first red line going upwards, that is the aggregate change to global GDP that we are assuming for all of those 8 countries together. And this decade, their combined growth will be more than double the contribution to world GDP of that of the United States and Europe. China on its own, even with weaker economic growth, will be responsible for half of that. China on its own is going to contribute as much to global economic activity as that of the US and the Euro area put together. If I jump forward to put it in the context of very popular discussions and the crisis going on in the Euro area, this is one of my favorite pictures, which I hope you can see. I'm trying to show you here is in the first 4 columns shaded in red is the size of 4 different economies. And then the last 2 columns show you the change in 1 year in China's GDP and the change in the 4 BRIC countries' GDP. And there are a couple of really powerful sound bites I like to use this data to show. And to emphasize it, if you look at the 5th line across, in 2011 alone, just in that 1 year, China's GDP increased by $1.37 trillion. Or as I'm fond of been saying for a number of months, translated into the context of the world economy, last year China was creating the economic equivalent of another Greece economy every 11.5 weeks. Or if you look at the third line across, the second line across Spain, in 1 year, China effectively created the equivalent of another Spanish economy. And if you look at the 4 BRIC countries collectively in 2011, creating nearly $2.2 trillion worth of GDP, that was the same as creating the economic equivalent of another Italy, which is the 8th largest economy in the world. So in 1 year, these 4 guys created another one. They are increasingly dominating the world economy. Let me go back to the second in the deck to translate it in terms of rates of growth of global GDP. It has become exceptionally fashionable because of the challenges many of the Western economies are facing post-2008 credit crisis. And goodness me, for those of us that live here in Britain, don't we just get bombarded by it every single minute of the day by some of our media, Louisa.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim.
Especially the print media. But as these countries become bigger, their impact on the world economy, linked to what I've just shown you, is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what you can see here is a table, hopefully you can see it, of the rates of real GDP growth in different parts of the world, going back to the start of the 1980s. I started my professional career in 1982, and this culminates in, again, what we are assuming this decade. And despite the fact the United States and the Euro area will not grow by the same rates they've grown in the past, because of what's going on in the BRIC countries and the growth market economies, even with softer rates of growth themselves, even with softer rates of growth, because they are getting more and more important, their impact on the world is going to become bigger and bigger. So contrary to much of, frankly, the nonsense which is written in the media, the world economy this decade will probably grow by more than it has done for the 30 years in which I've been currently professionally working, despite all the considerable challenges that we have in many parts of the West. This is a table that shows you what the share of global GDP will be by at the end of this decade if those things, broadly speaking, happen, and it will become hugely important for many other aspects of our life just beyond economics, including many issues to do with global governance and leadership. By 2015, the size of the 4 BRIC countries, this is less than 3 years away, collectively are probably going to become bigger than the United States. And that means when it comes to selecting the leadership of the International Monetary Fund, the head of the World Bank, and many other important forms of global governance, these countries will not only have an increasing say as to who they should be and how they would be structured, it would be pretty amazing if one of them were not the head of one of those institutions also. And if I fast forward to the final picture, which I'm sure very few of you can see, and I apologize again for that, this now jumps forward to 2050, and what it's trying to show you with, on the left of that blue dotted line is all of these emerging economies that will become, by then, newly defined growth economies. So beyond the 8, which you heard mentioned earlier from Louisa, there will be a number of others, including certainly all the rest of the Asian economies that are part of our Next 11 group.